In the summer of 1997, the most famous company in Silicon Valley was roughly 90 days from running out of money. Apple, the company that had put a computer in millions of homes, was losing around $1 billion a year. Its products were a confusing mess, and most experts had already written its obituary. Then, at a packed convention in Boston, its founder walked on stage and announced his rescue plan. The savior was not a bank or a Wall Street investor. It was Microsoft, the company Apple had spent 20 years calling the enemy. Bill Gates appeared on a giant screen above the stage, and the Apple faithful in the audience actually booed. That $150 million check kept Apple alive. 21 years later, that same company would become the first in history worth $1 trillion.
Take a seat. This meeting has one item on the agenda: how Apple came within 90 days of death, and then built the most valuable company the world has ever seen. Most of the stories told in this room end in ruin. This one is different. This is the rarest thing in business, a genuine resurrection. But do not mistake it for a fairy tale. Apple did not survive because of luck, or a clever advert, or a single beautiful gadget. It survived because a man who had been humiliated and thrown out of the company he founded was brought back to clean up the wreckage, and because he made a series of cold, ruthless decisions that almost nobody else had the nerve to make. Watch how he did it. This is what a comeback actually costs.
The story begins in 1976, in a garage in California, with two young men named Steve. Steve Wozniak was the engineering genius who designed the machines. Steve Jobs was the visionary who understood that ordinary people, not just hobbyists, would one day want a computer of their own. Their second product, the Apple II, became one of the best-selling computers of its era and helped launch the entire personal computer industry. When Apple went public in 1980, it created hundreds of millionaires in a single day, and Jobs, still in his 20s, was worth over $200 million. Then came 1984, and the Macintosh, the first computer most people had ever seen with a mouse and friendly on-screen pictures instead of typed commands. It was introduced with a single, legendary television advert during the Super Bowl. Apple looked unstoppable, and Jobs looked like a genius. But there was a problem. The Macintosh sold far slower than promised, and Jobs, brilliant but difficult, was at war with the very executive he had personally recruited to run the company, a man named John Sculley, whom Jobs had famously lured away from Pepsi by asking whether he wanted to sell sugar water for the rest of his life or come and change the world. In 1985, that war reached the boardroom, and the board did not side with the founder. They sided with the manager. At 30 years old, Steve Jobs was stripped of all real power and pushed out of the company he had built. Losing Jobs should have been a disaster. For a while, it looked like the opposite. Without its temperamental founder, Apple kept selling Macintosh computers at high prices and fat profits, and for several years the money rolled in. But underneath, the company was beginning to rot. Apple flooded the market with a bewildering jungle of products, dozens of nearly identical models with confusing names that even its own salespeople could not keep straight. It missed the most important shift in the entire industry, the rise of cheap computers running Microsoft Windows, which by the mid-1990s was running on more than 90% of the personal computers on Earth. Apple's share of the market shrank year after year. Its software was aging, its big bets failed, and a parade of chief executives tried and failed to stop the bleeding. By 1996, Apple was losing enormous sums of money and burning through cash. Meanwhile, the exiled founder had not disappeared. Jobs had started a new computer company called NeXT and bought a small graphics studio that would become Pixar, the studio behind Toy Story. He had spent more than a decade learning, out in the wilderness, the lessons he had been too arrogant to learn the first time. And then, desperate for new software and out of ideas, Apple did something almost poetic. In late 1996, it agreed to buy NeXT for around $429 million. And in the fine print of that deal, Steve Jobs came home.
Pause here because the room should understand exactly what it is watching. A company in crisis almost never reaches back for the person it threw out. Pride forbids it. But Apple was past pride. It was out of time and out of options, and the only asset it had left was a founder who, in his years of exile, had finally learned the one thing he lacked: discipline. The young Jobs had vision and no restraint. The older Jobs, returning to Apple, had vision and a knife. And the first thing a great turnaround needs is not inspiration. It is somebody willing to walk into a beloved, bloated, dying institution and cut away almost everything it has become. Most leaders cannot do it. They protect, they hesitate, they try to please everyone. Watch what Jobs did instead.
By the middle of 1997, the situation was dire. Apple had gone through chief executive after chief executive, and Jobs, officially just an advisor, quietly took control. He would later say the company was perhaps 90 days from bankruptcy. So he made the decision that defines this entire story. He swallowed his pride and picked up the phone to the one company with the cash and the motive to help: Microsoft. The deal he struck was stunning. Microsoft would invest $150 million in Apple, and crucially, promised to keep making its Office software for the Macintosh for the next 5 years, because without Word and Excel, a Mac was useless to most businesses. In return, Apple settled a long and bitter legal feud. When Jobs announced it on stage in Boston, with Bill Gates beaming down from a giant screen, the audience of Apple loyalists actually booed, horrified to see their hero shaking hands with the enemy. But Jobs understood something they did not: survival first, pride later. Then he turned the knife on Apple itself. He walked into the company and started killing it, product by product. He cut a lineup of dozens of confusing machines down to just 4. He drew a simple 2x2 grid on a whiteboard: consumer and professional, desktop and portable. One great product for each box. Everything else, he canceled. It was brutal, it was unpopular, and it was exactly what Apple needed. With the company simplified and alive, Jobs did what he did best. He made things people fell in love with. In 1998, Apple released the iMac, a friendly, curvy, translucent computer in a shocking shade of blue, designed by a young Englishman named Johnny Ive. After years of dull beige boxes, it looked like it came from the future, and it sold by the millions. Apple was profitable again. But the computer was only the beginning. In 2001, Apple released the iPod and put 1,000 songs in your pocket. In 2007, Steve Jobs walked on stage and introduced the iPhone, a device that did not just save Apple, it remade the entire world and became the most profitable product in the history of business. The company that had been 90 days from death became a machine for printing money on a scale no one had ever seen. In August of 2018, Apple became the first American company in history to be worth $1 trillion. It would go on to be worth $2 trillion, and then $3 trillion. Steve Jobs himself did not live to see most of it. He died in 2011. But the company he rescued, simplified, and reinvented had become the most valuable on the face of the earth. The man they threw out at 30 had come back and built something no one could ever throw away.
Minutes recorded. Before we adjourn, one question for the room, and do leave your answer in the comments. Apple was saved by a man who had every reason to be bitter, who returned to the company that humiliated him and made the hardest, most unglamorous decisions imaginable, begging his enemy for help and cutting away most of what the company had become. So tell me, if you were handed back the very thing that once rejected you, broken and 90 days from the end, would you have the discipline to save it the way Jobs did, by killing most of it to rescue the rest? Or would you try to save everything and lose it all? Think on it. Next meeting, a different kind of resurrection. A comic book company so broke it sold off the movie rights to its own greatest heroes just to survive, then clawed its way back to become the most powerful force in Hollywood and was bought by Disney for $4 billion. Marvel. Subscribe. Attendance is taken.